America laughed. It was a sound that defined an entire era. A bright, rhythmic explosion of joy that filled millions of living rooms every Saturday night. At the center of that laughter was a tiny, charismatic boy with eyes that sparkled like diamonds and a smile that seemed to promise that everything in the world was going to be okay. But if you look closely at the tapes today, past the vibrant studio lights and the oversized sweaters, you can see the ghost of a tragedy. Behind that legendary grin, a child was slowly, systematically breaking apart. While the nation was safe in their homes, clutching their sides in laughter, Gary Coleman was clutching his life, counting the agonizing minutes until the next needle, the next surgery, the next desperate struggle to simply remain on this earth. In 1978, Gary became more than a celebrity. He became a national treasure. He was the miniature force of nature that made Diff'rent Strokes a global phenomenon. He gave a generation 6 words that became a cultural heartbeat, a phrase that would eventually be etched into his tombstone. "What you talkin' about, Willis?" To the world, it was a harmless punchline, a bit of comedic timing that felt like a warm hug. To Gary, it was a life sentence. It was the moment he realized that his value to the world was tied to his ability to remain a perpetual child, a mascot for an audience that didn't want him to grow up, and a body that physically wouldn't let him. Gary Coleman was the boy who made the world feel young, even as his own body felt ancient and weary. At 10 years old, while other children his age were learning to ride bicycles, skinning their knees in the sun, and dreaming of the future, Gary was already a weary veteran of the operating table. Born with a failing kidney and a body that seemed to reject the very world it was brought into, he had endured 3 major surgeries and 2 transplants before he even understood the concept of fame. He walked onto that soundstage every day with the weight of a dying body and the expectations of a multi-million-dollar industry resting on his 3-foot 8-inch frame. The true tragedy, however, wasn't just the illness, it was the cure. The powerful steroids that kept his body from rejecting his donor kidneys became his silent, invisible jailers. They froze him in time. They stunted his growth, locking his rapidly maturing soul and his aging heart inside the permanent, unchangeable cage of a small child. He was a prisoner of his own image, a grown man's mind, trapped in a doll's body, forced to perform for a nation that refused to see the man behind the boy. Every year that passed made the irony more painful. He was getting older, wiser and angrier, but the mirror and the world only ever saw Arnold Jackson. He became a millionaire before he ever felt the warmth or security of a normal childhood. At his peak, he was earning $70,000 a week more money than the President of the United States, but he couldn't buy a single day without the metallic taste of medication or the crushing exhaustion of dialysis. He was a child actor with a medical chart thicker than any script he ever memorized. He was adored by millions, but he was never truly protected. He was cheered until the rafters shook, but he was never truly seen. We loved the character, we worshipped the catchphrase, but we effectively ignored the boy. We watched him stand beneath those searing studio lights, delivering comedic perfection, while his kidneys were failing, and his spirit was eroding under the pressure of a fame he never asked for. This isn't just the story of a Hollywood star who lost his way. It is the story of a boy who was sacrificed at the altar of our collective entertainment. It is the saga of a child who gave us his joy, piece by agonizing piece, until there was absolutely nothing left for himself. Before we replay the reruns, let us face the devastating silence that lived behind the laughter. This is Gary Coleman, the smallest body and the heaviest truth. Gary Coleman did not enter this world to the sound of applause. He entered it to the sound of hospital monitors. Born on February 8, 1968, in the small town of Zion, Illinois, his life began in the shadow of abandonment. His biological mother, struggling with homelessness and unable to provide for him, surrendered him within days of his birth. It was a cold beginning for a soul that would one day warm the hearts of millions. He was eventually placed in the arms of Sue and Willie Coleman, a nurse and a lab technician who had spent years praying for a child. They saw a beautiful baby boy, but the doctors saw a medical emergency. Gary was born with atrophied kidneys, a congenital defect that meant his body was essentially poisoning itself from within. One kidney was already dead, the other was failing fast. Before he was even old enough to walk or speak, Gary had become a permanent resident of the pediatric ward. By the age of 5, while other children were learning to play in the dirt, he had already endured 3 major surgeries and 2 kidney transplants. But the medicine that saved his life came with a cruel, permanent tax. To prevent his body from rejecting the new kidneys, Gary was put on a heavy regimen of immunosuppressants and corticosteroids. These drugs were a miracle of science, but they were also a curse for a growing child. They puffed up his cheeks, giving him that adorable round face that Hollywood would later fall in love with, but they also shut down his growth plates. His body was forced into a state of eternal childhood. At school, the other kids didn't see a classmate. They saw a doll. They would pick him up, spin him around, and laugh as if he were a toy. Gary hated it. Inside that small frame, a fierce adult-like dignity was already forming, screaming for a respect he rarely received. It was during these fragile years that the performer inside him began to flicker to life. Ironically, it was his illness that led him to the stage. Because he couldn't play contact sports or run with the other boys, Gary found solace in the attention of adults. He watched his cousin earning money, modeling clothes, and told his mother with a seriousness that defied his age, "I can do that too." They wrote a letter to a department store, and soon the boy who had spent his life under the harsh fluorescent lights of hospital rooms was standing beneath the warm golden lights of a runway. He modeled for Sears Montgomery Ward and eventually commercials for Hallmark and McDonald's. He was small, yes, but he possessed a magnetic intensity that directors found baffling. He didn't just recite lines. He understood them. He carried himself with the poise of a veteran actor who had lived 1,000 lives. That was the spark that caught the eye of a talent scout for the legendary producer Norman Lear. Gary was auditioning for a revival of The Little Rascals, but the scout saw something far greater. He called Lear that night with a message that would change the course of television history. "You need to see this kid. He's 1 in a million. He's not a child actor. He's a miracle in a 3-foot frame." In 1977, Norman Lear signed Gary to a $1,000 a month retainer just to keep him available. Hollywood was a town full of bright, eager faces, but there was no one like Gary Coleman, fragile, yet fierce, innocent, yet wise. He began appearing in guest spots on The Jeffersons and Good Times, quietly preparing for the role that would make him the center of the American universe. A child who had spent his first years fighting death was about to spend his next years teaching a nation how to laugh. But as the cameras began to roll, the world ignored the most vital truth. The medicine was still in his system, the dialysis was still waiting in the wings, and the miracle was already starting to feel like a burden. By the time Diff'rent Strokes premiered in 1988, America was a nation searching for a reason to smile again. The scars of Vietnam and Watergate were still fresh, and racial tensions were simmering beneath the surface of the suburbs. Then came Gary Coleman, a pocket-sized miracle who seemed to bridge every gap with a single raise of an eyebrow. The premise was simple. A white billionaire adopts two black boys from Harlem. It was a fairy tale of racial harmony, and Gary was the magic that made everyone believe it was real. Within a single season, Gary wasn't just a child star. He was a global phenomenon. He was earning $70,000 a week, a staggering sum that made him the highest-paid actor on television, earning more than the President of the United States. His face was everywhere, on cereal boxes, lunch boxes, and Saturday morning cartoons. But as the money poured in, the golden cage began to close around him. The studio treated him like a star, but also like a highly sensitive piece of machinery. Because of his failing kidneys, the production had to be built around his medical needs. A special dressing room was constructed to house his dialysis equipment. The shooting schedule was a delicate dance between lighting cues and medical charts. But for the producers, the priority wasn't Gary's health, it was the product. They didn't see a boy struggling with a life-threatening illness. They saw a 48-inch gold mine that had to keep smiling at all costs. Todd Bridges, who played his brother Willis, later recalled the grueling reality of life on set. Gary was expected to deliver adult-level performances with a child's stamina, all while his body was essentially in a state of slow-motion collapse. He was forced to work long hours under scorching studio lights, often looking gray and exhausted, between takes only to switch on that radiant Arnold Jackson smile the second the red light on the camera turned on. The medicine that kept him alive continued to puff his cheeks, creating a face that the world found adorable. But for Gary, that face was a mask of pain. As he moved into his teenage years, a new kind of horror emerged. Because his growth was stunted, Gary remained trapped in the body of a child while his mind was maturing. He was 15, 16, 17 years old, navigating the complexities of puberty and identity. But the world still demanded he be the cute little Arnold. The industry refused to let him grow up because Arnold Jackson was a billion-dollar brand, and a grown man named Gary Coleman didn't fit the marketing plan. He was a man-child in a world of giants, a prisoner of a catchphrase that he grew to loathe. The pressure inside his home was becoming just as suffocating as the studio. His parents, Sue and Willie, managed every aspect of his life and every cent of his fortune. Money had become the primary language of their relationship. Every contract renegotiation, every public appearance, every autograph was another brick in the wall between Gary and a normal life. He began to realize that the people meant to protect him were the ones most invested in his exploitation. By the mid-1980s, the laughter on the set of Diff'rent Strokes began to sound hollow. His co-star, Dana Plato, was spiraling into addiction. Todd Bridges was facing legal troubles, and Gary was becoming increasingly isolated and cynical. He had seen too many adults smile at him on camera, only to argue over his commission when the lights went out. He was the most famous child in the world, yet he didn't own his own body, his own money, or his own future. The cage was made of gold, but the bars were very, very real. When Diff'rent Strokes finally went off the air in 1986, Gary Coleman was 18 years old. On paper, he had reached the threshold of manhood, but in the eyes of the public, he was a frozen relic, a ghost of a childhood that America was already beginning to tuck away in the attic of nostalgia. The applause had died down. The studio lights had grown cold, and for the first time in his life, Gary stepped out from the towering shadow of Arnold Jackson to survey the empire he had spent nearly a decade building with his own sweat and blood. What he found was not a kingdom, but a wasteland of broken promises. For nearly 10 years, Gary had been the most valuable child on the planet. He had been a literal gold mine for the network, earning an estimated $18 million at the height of his fame. That fortune should have been a fortress, a guarantee of world-class health care, a life of comfort for his parents, and a secure future that would allow him to never work another day if he chose. But when he finally sought to access the accounts he believed were waiting for him, the numbers didn't just fall short. They screamed of a devastating heist. The millions he had bled for the grueling nights spent on dialysis between takes. The very childhood he had sacrificed for NBC's primetime ratings, almost all of it had vanished into a fog of expenses and management fees. In 1989, Gary did the unthinkable, a move that would forever change how the world viewed the perfect Coleman family. He filed a massive lawsuit against his own parents, Sue and Willie Coleman, and his former business manager. He stood before the world and accused the only people who were supposed to be his sanctuary of systematic cold-blooded theft. He claimed they had siphoned off over $1 million of his hard-earned money into their own pockets while he was busy making the nation laugh. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was a public autopsy of a family's soul. The headlines across the country were merciless, dripping with a cynical irony. Child star sues parents for greed. The same nation that had once cooed at his cuteness now watched with a voyeuristic hunger as Gary Coleman was forced to tear his own private life apart in open court just to survive. The betrayal cut deeper than any surgeon's knife ever had. During the trial, his parents didn't retreat. They fought back with a coldness that stunned the young actor. They countersued for defamation, painting Gary as ungrateful, erratic, and mentally unstable. They argued that his millions had been rightfully spent on his upkeep, his luxury lifestyle, and his mounting medical bills. But Gary saw the truth through the smoke. He saw a father who had quit his job to live like a king off his son's labor, and a mother who had managed his career with the cold calculation of a business transaction rather than the love of a parent. He once told a reporter with a bitterness that seemed to chill the very air, "I didn't just lose money. I lost a childhood I can never buy back. I lost the only two people on this earth I was told I could trust. How do you put a price tag on that?" The trial dragged on for 4 agonizing years, a period during which Gary's health plummeted under the crushing weight of the stress. Every day in court was another day. His dignity was stripped away piece by piece as his private medical struggles and financial ruin were paraded for the tabloids. In 1993, a judge finally ruled in his favor, awarding him $3 million. On paper, it was a victory. In reality, it was a hollow shell of a win. After years of legal fees, taxes, and debts, the million was only a fraction of what had been stolen. More importantly, the bridge to his past was now a pile of ash. He was 25 years old. His career was dead. His health was failing, and he was completely alone in a world that still expected him to be adorable. Depression followed the verdict like a predatory shadow. Twice during those years, Gary tried to end his own life, overdosing on sleeping pills in the dark. He was tired. Tired of being a headline, tired of being a punchline, and tired of being treated like a broken toy that had outlived its novelty. The great betrayal hadn't just taken his money. It had taken his reason to keep fighting. He was no longer a star in the sky. He was a survivor of a childhood that had been sold to the highest bidder while he wasn't looking. By the mid-1990s, the mansion on Park Avenue was a distant memory. The chauffeur-driven cars and the entourage of fans had evaporated, leaving Gary Coleman standing in the cold light of a reality he was never prepared for. He was an adult now, at least his birth certificate said so, but the world refused to let him grow up. He moved from one casting office to another, trying to find roles that required a man's depth only to be met with the same polite, soul-crushing smiles. Producers didn't want Gary. They wanted a time machine. They wanted the kid who said the line. When they realized he was no longer that child, they treated him like a defective product. He was a man in exile, banished from the only world he had ever known. But the bills didn't care about his legacy, and the dialysis treatments didn't stop, just because his shows were no longer on prime time. To survive, Gary had to do the one thing Hollywood finds unforgivable. He had to get a real job. In 1998, the man who once earned $70,000 a week was spotted wearing a uniform and carrying a flashlight. He was working as a security guard at a shopping mall in Los Angeles. The tabloids pounced. They treated his job not as a dignified effort to support himself, but as a fall from grace, a spectacle to be mocked. But the real trauma wasn't the job. It was the people. Every day, Gary had to endure the fans who would walk up to him while he was on duty laughing, pointing, and demanding he say the catchphrase. They didn't see a human being trying to make an honest living. They saw a relic that they owned. One afternoon, the tension finally snapped. A woman followed him through a parking lot, mocking his height and badgering him for an autograph in a way that felt more like a taunt than a request. Gary, exhausted from a lifetime of being treated like a doll, finally fought back. He hit her. The incident made national headlines instantly. He was charged with assault, forced to pay her medical bills, and ordered into anger management classes. The media didn't talk about the years of harassment or the psychological toll of being a forever child. They simply branded him as angry and difficult. A year later, the financial walls finally closed in. Gary declared bankruptcy. The medical bills from his lifelong kidney battle, the astronomical legal fees from the fight with his parents, and the lack of steady work had drained every cent. He was no longer America's favorite kid. He was a bankrupt man with a failing body living in a world that didn't forgive small mistakes or small people. Yet even in the dirt, Gary's spirit refused to be completely extinguished. In 2003, he made one last surreal attempt to be taken seriously as a man with a voice. He announced he was running for governor of California. It started as a publicity stunt by a local newspaper, but Gary took it to heart. He stood on debate stages next to Arnold Schwarzenegger, speaking with a sharp, cynical intelligence about the struggles of the working class and the flaws in the system. He didn't win. He finished 8th out of over 100 candidates. But for a brief moment as he stood at that podium, the dark sunglasses and the uniform were gone. He wasn't Arnold. He wasn't a security guard. He was a man named Gary Coleman, reminding America that he was still here, still breathing, and still demanding to be seen as more than a punchline. It was a fleeting victory, a moment of dignity in a sea of exile. But it was proof that even after the lights go out, a heart can still beat with a fierce, defiant fire. When Gary Coleman smiled on television, America saw innocence. But when he cried in real life, America turned its back. The tragedy of Gary Coleman wasn't just a personal failure. It was a systemic one. It was the American dream turned inside out, exposing the cold, hard machinery that grinds up the vulnerable and calls it entertainment. Diff'rent Strokes was sold to the public as a groundbreaking show about love crossing the lines of color and class. On the surface, it promised a post-racial utopia where a wealthy white man could save 2 black boys from the struggles of Harlem, proving that kindness could erase centuries of inequality. But off-screen, the reality was a mirror image of the very problem the show claimed to solve. Gary was adored by a white nation, but he was never truly seen as an equal. To the system, He was a commodity, a brilliant, charming mascot, whose blackness was only useful as long as it remained adorable and non-threatening. This is the cycle that has swallowed so many black stars before and after him. Hollywood loved Gary's charm, but it never built a space for his adulthood. There is a specific kind of cruelty in how the industry treats black child actors. They are celebrated when they are shining and providing joy, but they are forgotten, or demonized the moment their light begins to dim. Or they demand a seat at the table. When Gary grew older and his body refused to fit the cute mold anymore, the roles stopped coming. When he tried to negotiate his value, they called him difficult. When he finally broke down under the pressure of bankruptcy and betrayal, they didn't offer a hand, they offered a camera to film his collapse. The media turned his pain into a sport. They followed his lawsuits like they were soap operas, and his depression like it was a scandal. They booked him on talk shows not to hear his story, but to wait for him to snap so they could get the angry black man clip they wanted for the evening news. For the black community, Gary represented something much deeper than a sitcom character. He was a child who carried the collective burden of being both beloved and belittled. His success told young black kids that they could make it to the top, but his suffering served as a haunting reminder of what the system does to those who get there without protection. The industry gave him money, but it took his peace. It gave him fame, but it stole his identity. Across the globe, Gary's name eventually became shorthand for the child star curse. But for those who look deeper, it was more than a curse. It was a reflection of a society that loves its symbols but fears its truths. We wanted the laughter of a black boy from Harlem, but we didn't want the baggage of his health, his rage, or his humanity. Maybe that's the truth America still doesn't want to face, that Gary Coleman wasn't just a victim of Hollywood greed. He was a reflection of us, a society that knows how to watch someone live, but still hasn't learned how to help them survive. We built our laughter around his body, while ignoring the fact that the body was breaking under the weight of the very joy it provided. By the spring of 2010, Gary Coleman was no longer a headline. He was no longer the wicked picket of the sitcom world, nor the angry security guard of the tabloids. He was living quietly in Santa Quin, Utah, a world away from the toxic glare of Hollywood. Neighbors described him as a man of shadows, polite but distant, a man who carried the invisible weight of being remembered for someone he no longer recognized in the mirror. He had found a fragile kind of peace, but his body, the small, battered vessel that had carried him through 42 years of war, was finally ready to surrender. Then came the afternoon of May 26th. In the quiet of his home, Gary slipped and fell down a flight of stairs. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood ending. It was a mundane, tragic accident. He hit his head, suffering a brain hemorrhage. 2 days later, in a hospital bed, surrounded by white walls that looked far too much like the rooms of his childhood, the decision was made to remove him from life support. At 12:05 p.m. on May 28, 2010, the voice that had once filled every living room in America went silent. The news broke, and for a few brief hours the world remembered. Clips of a chubby-cheeked boy flooded social media. Fans typed, "Rest in peace, Arnold." But as quickly as the tributes appeared, the noise faded. There was no grand public funeral. There were no statues erected in his honor. Only a messy, lingering cloud of questions about his final moments and the years of loneliness that had preceded them. Hollywood didn't build monuments for child stars who broke under the pressure. It simply looked for the next one. Still, something of Gary Coleman lingers in the static of our collective memory. His face remains frozen on old tapes, a permanent reminder of a time when we believed joy was simple. But every time someone replays that famous catchphrase, they are now hearing more than a joke. They are hearing the echo of everything it cost him. They are hearing the sound of a boy who was asked to carry the happiness of a nation while his own world was collapsing. Gary's legacy isn't found in wealth or awards. It is found in the truth his life revealed that fame without protection is a form of cruelty, that a nation can adore a symbol while utterly abandoning the human being behind it. That laughter is not the same as love. For the Black community, his story remains a haunting cautionary tale, a reminder of how the world often demands Black joy without being willing to witness Black pain. Gary Coleman entered the world fighting for his life, and he left it the same way. He was a boy who should have died young, but he chose to live long enough to make us laugh. And in that, there is a profound, heartbreaking grace. Maybe in the silence that followed his final breath, he finally found what Hollywood could never give him: the right to grow up, the right to be still, and the right to finally be at peace. To anyone who has ever stood alone in the dark after the lights went out, Gary's story says, "We see you. We remember you." Because sometimes the smallest bodies are the ones that hold the heaviest truths.